Back in 2021, I was very active in the Among Us art community. It started even earlier, like it started in late 2020 because I found a bunch of Among Us art comics that were originally posted to Instagram but reposted to YouTube, and I got into all of them. I was obsessed with what this fandom would create for these silly bean characters, and I was very inspired by it, so I started making my own, but I didn't post it anywhere. That was until 2021. After months, and I mean months because I think this was back in like April. So between late 2020 and April 2021, I was just quietly like internet stalking this community and looking upon it with awe, wanting to join but being too shy. I found a DTIYs that I thought it looked really cool. I was like, "Oh, that picture is so cool. I want to draw that." And I finally got the bravery to just do it. And from there, I was hooked. I For the remainder of that year, all I did was draw Among Us. I made a bunch of Among Us OCs. I joined a bunch of different DTIYs, but most importantly, I was making like a Among Us fan comic. I was so proud of it back then. It's funny looking back, but genuinely that part of my life is very it's a very happy part of my life. But then, after about a year of nonstop drawing Among Us fan art, I left. And despite this being a decision that I made like 4 years ago now, ah, it's something that I still kind of regret, and I still feel like a sadness over it. I'll start at the beginning. So, like, when I left, there were two reasons I stated that I left. The first is that the comic that I was making is a comic I was taking very seriously, and I wanted to add, like, more dark elements to it. Which, considering that Among Us is a fandom that tends to attract younglings, I didn't know, and I wasn't super comfortable with young people being able to see the comic I was trying to create. Which, to be fair, is something that I still feel today with that particular comic. I would not be comfortable with younglings looking at it, but I feel like I should have just tried to make it clear that my account was more intended for a mature audience and try to like put warnings of don't look at my art if you're under the age of 18 versus just up and leaving the fandom. And the second reason why is because since Among Us was very big at that time, it was getting very big. It was beginning to be like merchandised. I don't remember fully, but I think it was already like being merchandised. I was a little nervous about if Among Us was sold to a different company, would I still be allowed to make fan art? Because you got to understand, I'm one of those people that will read the terms and conditions. So before I joined the Among Us community and started drawing fan art, I looked up like the Among Us's stance, like Inner stance on fan art, and found out that they're very chill about fan art. But I heard so many horror stories about like other fandoms and other companies not being all that chill about fan art. So there was a part of me that was kind of nervous, like, oh hey, if this game is ever sold to a different company, will I end up in some legal like shit for drawing fan art, which now looking back on was a very silly irrational fear of mine, or at least I think it was probably a very silly irrational fear of mine, but it was one that I was genuinely kind of nervous about back then. However, despite the fact that these were two things that I wasn't lying about, I did genuinely have these anxieties back then. Looking back on it, I don't really think that's the reason I left. I don't think they helped, but I think the reason I left was more due to stuff that I, at the time, didn't feel comfortable talking about. And the actual reason I left, or the real thing that really drove me to leave, was that I was being pressured to leave. And instead of having a backbone and saying no, I caved in and left. I had just started art school at the time, and one of our first classes we had to set up a portfolio, or I don't remember fully what it was, but it was something in relation to a portfolio or showing our social media accounts. And I felt very awkward because my social media account for my art was filled with Among Us fan art, which didn't feel super professional at the time. This school had a very heavy focus on being professional and developing a professional portfolio, which, to be fair, is what I wanted at the time. I'm not upset with the school for this, but I felt very awkward because I felt like my options were either I show my Among Us fan art or I don't show my Among Us fan art, but then I won't be able to show my best work since that was where most of my artistic energy had gone into. I was really into it. And as mentioned before, I was working on a comic, and that comic was the thing that I was the most proud of at the time. So it felt like if I didn't show the Among Us fan art, I would not be able to show my best work, essentially. So I decided to start making that comic as more humanoid in hopes that I could keep it as part of my main workflow without it feeling as unprofessional. Which, to be fair, once again, this is not a decision that I necessarily regret. This is a comic that I'm still very passionate about and would like to maybe finish it and publish it one day. And to do that, it would have to not be fan art. However, I feel like that was a decision that I should have been making now and have not been making back in 2022. I feel like back then I was entering this college. It was going to be very stressful. I feel like I should have kept that to be the thing that I do for fun on the side. And then I should have started making the humanoid version of this comic later on, once I was out of school. The second reason I ended up leaving was because I felt like I was being pressured by some family members to leave. So a bit of drama happened when I was in the Among Us community. There was a character I had in OC, and there was another Among Us artist in the community who had an OC who was the same color as my OC. I'm not going to say exactly which character it was because I don't want people figuring out like who the other Among Us artist was, because this is a person who I don't know where they are in their life. I don't know if they're still doing Among Us stuff. I haven't seen or heard of. I don't even remember this person's username, to be quite honest. But they essentially accused me of stealing their OC because our characters had the same color. To the best of my ability, if I remember correctly, our characters had the same color, had the same name, and I think they both had like antennae. But that was where like the similarities began and ended. Like everything else about these two characters, from my remembrance, like they were very different from each other. My character had a different gender, a different age, a different personality, a different backstory, different everything else. And you know what? Considering this was Among Us, where most of the characters were a color and named after a color, I think it was a little silly to accuse me of stealing their OC based off the fact that I just used the same color. Like, I picked that color because it was just happened to be one of my favorite colors. And you know what? Like, when it happened, they originally were like, hey, can you just change the name of the character? Because I think you unintentionally took inspiration from my character. And you know what? I kind of understood why they thought that, or I knew why they thought that, because a few days ago, before I had showed my character, they showed, went through their account because we were talking, and I saw they had a character with the same color, and I was like, oh wow, that character is so cool. Because who would have thought that I would find a character that happens to be one of my favorite colors to look very cool? So after they accused me of like unintentionally taking inspiration from their character, I was like, wait a minute. I have proof, or I have screenshots in the old file when I originally designed this character, because while I hadn't posted my character before, I had designed them months ago, because I tend to design things in advance but don't always share it right away. So I dug through my files and was capable of proving to them or showing them, like, hey, actually, I designed my character before you posted yours. So how could I have taken inspiration from your character when I was designing my character, your character didn't exist on the internet yet. And after I showed them that, that kind of like stopped the argument. They kind of just backed down and were like, oh, okay, fine. And after this happened, I was just telling some family members about it or just talking about it because I thought the whole situation, like, once it happened, it was on my mind because it was like, wow, someone just accused me of stealing their character, even though I did not steal their character. Their character didn't even exist when I made my character and I was talking about it. And I had a family member who, when I was talking about this story, told me maybe this was a sign I should leave the Among Us community, which I felt like came kind of out of left field because I was like, how, just because I had one bad experience, why should I leave the community for that? Hey, even though this experience was kind of like annoying, I wouldn't even really say it was a bad experience. It was more just frustrating, to be quite honest, but wasn't really enough for me to want to pack my bags and go. And then I can't really remember many more specific examples. That particular example is the one that stands out to me the most, I think, because the story that goes with it is the most memorable. But I remember, or at least think I remember, that person saying to me in other occasions that, hey, maybe this is a sign to leave the Among Us community. Because, like, I remember, like, I'd see some drama happening and I'd talk about it because I was very invested in the Among Us community. And whenever something was going down, I would usually talk about it, would usually be on my mind a little bit. And it felt like a common occurrence, or I think it was. I don't want to unintentionally lie because I can't fully remember, but I'm pretty sure this person kept telling me, like, hey, maybe this is a sign you should leave, or maybe this is the time that you leave, or maybe it's time that you move on and you go do something else. And I think if I am remembering correctly, that pressure eventually got to me and I decided it was time to head out. And I think that's where I made my mistake. I think that's why I ended up regretting leaving and why this particular part of my art life has kind of stuck with me for so long. And I feel like a regret with leaving is because I wasn't really ready to. I did it more because I felt pressured to and not because I actually wanted to leave at that point. And I think the other part that made this difficult is that when I finally realized, like, oh, the reason why I'm so sad about this and the reason why I'm still kind of stuck in this part of my life is because I left it prematurely. But by then, the interest in Among Us had genuinely left. Like, at this point in time, while I do still enjoy drawing Among Us every now and again, it's not something I want to draw super intensely anymore. I can't say there weren't a handful of times in which I tried going back to the Among Us community. Kind of. I remember at one point I got an idea for a different Among Us fan comic that was much more of a horror project, and I made another Instagram account specifically to make that comic because I kind of felt embarrassed going back to the Among Us community on my main account after announcing, hey, I'm done with this. So I was like, let me do this quietly on an alt that hopefully nobody will recognize me on. And I posted 4 times on it and then never posted it again because I just did not have the time to make it. And then there were some other silly stories that happened that were probably driven by my regret and sadness around leaving the Among Us community. For example, this character. This is a character that I found in an auction. And I remember I had the second highest bid on this auction, but somebody outbid me last second. And I was really sad that I lost the character, but oh well, it was just, a silly Among Us creature. But around a year later, I saw that person was trying to rehome a bunch of their OCs, so I asked about it. And hey, I was capable of art trading, and now I have the little bean is now a part of my character horde, and I love them to death. So anyway, I feel like I digressed a little bit. I guess my point is just I left this fandom prematurely. I shouldn't have left. I should have had a backbone and should have stayed probably at least until I was done with college. I think after that I probably would have genuinely left because that was around when I stopped being interested in Among Us, and now instead of being interested in Among Us, I'm interested in Mafia because some things just never change. Anyway, I think it is time to talk about the art featured in this video. as mentioned earlier, this is a very silly Among Us OC that I had gotten from an art trade. Their name is the Suspuff. I think they are the most cursed OC that I own, and I love them for that. This was, image-wise, I was mainly just trying to create like a aesthetically pleasing image of my little Suspuff bean creature thingy. I ended up altering their character design. Usually on the little collar they have a like fake plastic knife, but I ended up not drawing it this time and just draw the little extra fluff because I wanted them to look extra fluffy, and that's about it. It's just a little silly fun little doodle I wanted to make. Anyway, that is about it. I hope you'll have a great week, and make sure to subscribe to prevent grease fires.